Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Geekfest this Tuesday. My name's Peter Lewis. I'm the Director of Essential Media, as you guys know. And this is our time to have a look through the fortnightly Guardian Essential Report with my partner in crime, Katharine Murphy, who is yet to be in the room, which is why we kept you waiting for a couple of minutes. Katharine's down in Parliament. It's a sitting week. She's texted me that she's on her way. So you're going to have to you're going to have to put up with me for the first little bit of this, but we do have a very special guest who I'll introduce in a moment as well. Before we get going though, respects to traditional owners on the land on which we all meet. I'm on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I'm sure you join me in paying respects to elders past, present, and emerging and recognising the land that we're all on was never ceded. Now, you guys keep coming back because of the polling, and we have really interesting discussions about the insights that we get from the public, and then we get to election time and then everyone tells you the polls aren't working. And part of the challenge as pollsters is to continually to get it right, and then to also help educate the public about what polls are and what they're not. So while we're waiting for Katharine to join us to talk through this week's poll, we're really lucky to have a colleague, actually a former workmate of mine, who's now, I guess, a friendly competitor, Campbell White, who is the who heads up YouGov, which runs Newspoll in Australia, but he's also the new chair of the Australian Polling Council, which has been established with all the organisations that do political polling in Australia to work together to share information, I guess also to raise public understanding of what political polling is, and critically what it isn't. So I thought before we get into this week's poll, it'd be great. And I know there's a bit of discussion in the room a fortnight ago about the polls and where the polling companies were cooperating or not cooperating with other external reviews. So I thought it would be good to invite Campbell in and just talk a bit about the polling council and how the companies such as Essential, such as YouGov, such as Ipsos are trying to work together to improve understanding of the polling and obviously also improve the outcomes when it matters. So Campbell, thanks for your time today. Do you want to tell the people a little bit about the idea behind the Polling Council and what we're setting out to achieve there?
Sure. So hi everyone. So the reason that we set up the Australian Polling Council was there really wasn't an organisation in Australia which represented the organisations that were involved. And after the 2019 election, I thought that there was really a role for people who actually knew what they were talking about to be out there talking publicly and talking about what had happened and sort of explaining to the public polling and how it sort of develops. I mean, I think there is an opportunity going forward for pollsters collectively to do a much better job in sort of explaining how polls are done. The vast majority, well, in fact, all polling that I'm aware of in Australia is basically done with good intentions, and it's generally done pretty well. And it is, we don't have, hyper sort of partisan results coming out that come out in other countries. Everybody's trying to do their best essentially. So I think it's really important to have an organisation that is out there sort of talking about, Peter's no doubt talked about, there is a degree of uncertainty in any scientific process. Polling is trying to use the scientific research method to come up with our findings.
Well, let's unpack that a little, Campbell. So when we say scientific research method, so you're a PhD in I'm going to say statistics or something in that field.
Social psychology, but anyway.
Fantastic. So explain the science behind polling and the idea of sampling and why it's so often, pretty close to being accurate and how the whole machine works.
Well, it's actually a pretty important thing that Peter's mentioned, because I read on Twitter from time to time, people say, well, I've got 10,000 people who have answered my question on Twitter, which say, you know, that they think that Scott Morrison is, you know, who's better, Scott Morrison or
the other guy.
The other guy. Well, some bizarre sort of question. They say, well, you know, 10,000 people answered my poll, so therefore it must be better and more accurate than Essential or News Poll, because they only interview 1,500 people. Now, the reason that doesn't really work like that is a fairly sort of basic thing that pollsters should have been out there explaining, that, you know, we are going to a lot of effort to make sure that the sample we are doing is as representative of the population as possible, rather than simply an opt-in sort of process. And I just don't think, you know, that we've done a great job collectively in sort of explaining those sort of things to people. You know, there is a scientific process, what we're trying to do. I mean, you can describe it as random sampling, but what we're effectively trying to do nowadays is we're trying to construct samples that are as representative as possible of the Australian population. And in every pollster does things a bit differently, but, you know, that involves things like, you know, making sure you have the right number of young males, making sure you have the right number of women over 70. But other things since the election which become increasingly important are things like education. So, you know, making sure that you have the right number of young people who do not have a university degree. It's actually an interesting point when people talk about education. You know, education is correlated with age in this country, because at a certain, you know, up till a certain point in time, university was very expensive and really only accessed by quite wealthy, well-off people. Whereas, you know, nowadays, my children are going through university, and, you know, about probably 70% of people in that age group are going to some form of tertiary education. So it's those sort of things, to take those into account, are pretty important. And it's not simple, because, you know, as I've pointed out, you know, you can't just weight by education, because, you know, there is
age as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, there's a range of things which I think people are looking at, and you know, it's our job to explain things better. We also need to explain.
Can I just also say, Campbell, I think one of the problems is that often polling is seen as predictive rather than descriptive. And by that, I mean, polls will never tell you what's going to happen in the future. They're only going to tell you what people say they're going to do in the future. And there's often a huge gap between that. One of the really interesting issues was, for about a decade, from 2007 through to 2016, those statements of intention mapped up with the actual results. But both in European polling, American polling, and then in Australian polling, that kind of stopped happening. And I think that the analysis of why that stopped happening is a really interesting and important piece of work. Before you answer that, I'll also now introduce, Katharine is in the room, I think. Are you there, Katharine? And hello.
I'm very sorry to be late.
That's all right. You missed you've missed our dissertation on polling. So I don't know if you've met Campbell before, who runs YouGov Australia and also the News Poll, but he's also the head of the new Australian Polling Council. So we're just sort of been having a bit of a chat about that in your absence. So if you want to throw any curly ones at Campbell, as we'll offer to the room as well in a sec. Starting with Karen, who's just said, isn't it arguable that polling now influences the way some people vote? And if so, should we be doing it at all, Campbell? So there's a couple of things to throw at you.
Potential question.
I think, like a lot of the things that people say about polling, it's actually, there's not a lot of evidence for that. There's not a lot of evidence that people change their votes. Whereas it might have some impact on, I I think in the case of Australia, where we have compulsory turnout, I mean, you can make an argument, for example, in the US or the UK or a country where voting is optional, that people might make the decision, well, I can't be bothered turning out to vote because either because my side is going to win easily or because they haven't got a chance. So I think in those sort of countries, there's a plausible argument to be made in that respect. But like a lot of things that are sort of said about polling, I don't know how much scientific evidence there is that, one of the things that comes up often is, the shy Tory thing. So the shy Tory thing was raised in the UK in an election a few cycles ago. And it was basically based on the idea that, well, there's these conservative people who are too shy to admit to a pollster that they vote that particular way. Now, the problem is that gets sort of trundled out at every election, basically. But in the Australian context, there's actually very little evidence for it.
Well, also that we do anonymous online polling, and I think you do, and so
exactly.
there's no human discussion anyway. It was interesting after America. There was a sense, even after the last one, there was discussion of shy Trump. I thought the more compelling analysis there was if the polls were undersampling, it was because there's a cohort of people who are disengaged from the system who just won't do polls. They're not lying to pollsters. They're just not picking up the phone, but they might be going and voting for Trump. But again, I guess the critical question, Campbell, is, are we in a world where sampling has just stopped working and we're constantly playing catch up, or have there just been a couple of results on the edges of margin of error? Because
I think we're in a transition.
Depending on which way you like, sorry?
I think we're in a transition is the best way to sort of think of it. Basically when, even though I'm very old and grey, this does go a bit before my time. But if you go back to sort of the early 80s and sort of mid 80s in polling, if you actually look historically at the results of polls during that period, they're actually considerably worse than they are right now. It was actually quite common for things that happened for the things that have happened in 2019 to actually happen around that time as well. We sort of went through a period historically where, polling got better. And by the sort of the mid 2000s, polling was pretty consistently accurate. And so what happens, of course, is everybody forgets that historical. So if you look at the sort of recent poll results, there's actually no evidence that, polling is any worse than it was over the longer term. Otherwise, polls said, for example, that Richard Nixon was going to beat Kennedy in 1960. In 1980, they had it as a very close race between Reagan and Carter. So historically there have been many examples. 1993 in Australia was an example where the failure was, just as great as what happened in 2019. The problem is people's expectations have changed over that period of time. Now, the reason I say it's transition is that we've actually moved from, that 1980s phase there was really the transition from the old sort of face-to-face methodologies to telephone interviews in that period. That sort of occurred over that period of time. And, I think there was a period where sort of, it's a new methodology. The pollsters are working out how do we control for those errors and sampling that exist in any methodology. And, I think they get better at it over time. I think with what's happened in the last decade, particularly the last 5 or 6 years, is telephone interviews aren't really working anymore. And the reason for that is because obviously mobile phones, but even if you call mobile phones, people don't necessarily answer them. They see on their call display. I mean, this is, if you think back even to the early 2000s, when somebody called you, you didn't know until you answered that call who it was. So you tended to answer it. Whereas now people look at the phone, I don't recognize that number. I'm letting it go through to voicemail. So, that is the reality of phone interviewing, that it's become more and more difficult. So people have transitioned to other methodologies. And I think, because those other methodologies are comparatively new, I think that's part of the cause of the sort of the issues that of reliability. And I think once pollsters collectively across the globe work this out, I think we'll go through another period of strong accuracy. I think it's really dangerous, I think, to say, well, there's been a couple of high-profile failures in recent years, therefore polling is finished. The evidence for that, it just isn't there. So anyway.
Catherine,
Just
go for it.
One question, and I'm really sorry I missed this conversation, which sounds fascinating. I sort of caught the tail end that there was a conversation about sampling and the difficulties of controlling for education because of age cohorts and all of that sort of stuff, but controlling for education seems to be one of the differences in the states that has sort of made some polls more accurate and others not so much. But anyway, setting that to one side, I get this argument, Campbell, about how we're sort of we're transitional in terms of the methodology, right? Like that now we're not doing it on the phone, we're doing it online because that's, we're basically kind of iterating how you do polls, and we'll reach a sweet spot where things are more accurate again. I guess my counterfactual question to that would be, polls are expensive. Accurate, like big sample sizes that deliver accurate polls are really expensive. The sort of economics of polling has shifted. Like obviously there's a lot of money in the corporate sector to do it, but not a lot of money in media companies to invest big bucks in polls in this day and age, right? So we might hit a sweet spot in terms of mastering the technology, but how do we hit the sweet spot in terms of raising the money to get the sample size that we're sufficiently happy with, that's sufficiently diverse in order to hit your accuracy sweet spot?
I think that the newer methodologies are less expensive on the surface of it, at least, but they require more. They require more skill, in a sense. I think there's also I think we have to look at the alternatives to polling as well, to be quite honest, because everybody
Which is really predictive data analysis, isn't it? Like just taking big wads of data and trying to run a secret sauce through that.
Well, so you'd actually argue that some of that has actually been less accurate generally than the polls themselves. And part of the problem in the US, for example, is people sort of look at, these probability models, which say, Trump has Biden has a 95% chance of winning. Now, the problem is that people look at that and they think, well, that means it's certain that Biden's going to win and it's going to be a landslide. But it actually doesn't say that at all, because a 95% of, Nate Silver came out and said, well, it's actually right because he did win. And that's all we were saying. There's a 95% chance of him winning.
But to Catherine's question, isn't it interesting that the highest profile American pollster actually is just taking other people's polling and then repurposing it? Like, again, where's the economic model for the pollsters? It's interesting and at times a little frightening. Katharine, we've been really assiduous in not running horse race. I think the Oz still does a bit more of that with your polls, Campbell. I'm interested in your thoughts of how your poll's being used as a horse race, and whether, Kieran, or I think Carol's pointed out in the chat, whether the rich insights actually come from the numbers or also from more qualitative research, either asking people's opinions on issues, which we tend to do, or actually sitting them in focus groups.
Well, the horse race is of interest to some people, and that is why they publish it. It's probably a question for them. I don't think that it's sort of. I mean, we have to keep this in context too. And the Australian in the Australian context, in the last decade, we basically had two elections out of all the state and federal elections. There's about 30 of them that occurred in the last decade. Basically had two where the polls picked the wrong winner in the horse race. So this idea that it doesn't work, I mean, look at the alternatives. I mean, realistically, if you went on Twitter, I'll give you a couple of examples. The polls were being faltered on Twitter before the 1920 elections because they were too pro the coalition. When a poll came down, the first news poll that came down with 51-49 to Labor, Twitter was basically, the message on Twitter was, that's bullshit. It is basically Labor's miles ahead. It's actually 53-47. So on the other side of it, I can tell you that there was a strong sort of view among journalists, not mentioning any journalists in particular, in the Victorian election, that it was incredibly close. And it ended up being a landslide. So the point is, the alternative to polling is people's opinions. And you know what they say about people's opinions. Everyone's got one. And you really can't. And after the event, people come out and say, well, I picked it. I said that such and such. But if you actually look at what people are saying before the event, polling is still a much better guide than almost anything else.
Sounds a bit like democracy. The word, it's terrible, but it's
yes.
But
that is a good way of looking at it.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Hey, thanks for that, Campbell, and we'll obviously keep people informed of anything that comes out of the polling council. I know you've got to get off and get your teeth drilled. I won't do the dentist joke because it's not 2:30 yet.
Yeah.
So good on you, mate, and all the best with the council. Katharine, thanks for joining us. It feels like we're going to do after talking about the polling as a concept. We'll go in and actually have a look at some real polling in a sec. But before we get there, I'm just interested in the vibe around the House, particularly vis-a-vis China at the moment. It seems a little bit febrile.
Yeah, a little bit febrile would be one way of putting it. It's sort of this story that's built and built and built, but we've sort of kind of hit a critical phase, really, I think, over the last 10 days or so, where we've had a succession of trade retaliations against Australia. And then yesterday we had the Foreign Ministry posting a doctored image, which is obviously it's a formal diplomatic channel and it's highly irregular behaviour, and that prompted the Prime Minister into doing two things simultaneously, which were quite interesting. At one level, demanding that the disinformation be withdrawn and that China apologise for the diplomatic affront, but also launching his strongest plea, clearest plea yet, I think, to resume bilateral dialogue. Both of the, he's sort of trying to do both those things. He's trying to sort of, I don't know who it was who said don't never waste a good crisis, but he's trying to never waste a good crisis to the extent of hoping somehow now, hitting rock bottom or near rock bottom will sort of create the conditions for everyone to try and normalise things. It
doesn't seem like he's got a lot of hand, or we've got a lot of hand.
No, well, we've got some nuclear options. I mean, we could decide tomorrow, I suppose, not to sell any iron ore to China, which is a commodity that China doesn't have a ready substitute for. That would be a hell of a riposte, and I can't see the Australian government doing it. I suppose we could have expelled all of the Chinese diplomats yesterday. We didn't do that. So it's sort of like, what the government wants is a reset. The government doesn't want to, the government has been trying really for several weeks now to de-escalate this situation and try and reset it. And I said in a comment piece last night, it's sort of like Morrison keeps articulating Australia's end game because he wants to make it clear to China that we're not being deputy sheriff, we're not running some American line. Our responses and criticisms relate to our own democratic interests, not anybody else's. And he's saying consistently over the last couple of weeks, look, we're not in the containment camp or the economic containment camp, which is an interesting proviso. We're not in the economic containment camp. We want peaceful coexistence with China. That is our end game. But of course, what we don't know is China's end game. And because there's been no communication between China and the Australian government, official or unofficial, for months, everybody's operating blind. No one really understands what China ultimately wants out of this, whether it's to make an example of a country that it feels it can afford to make an example of, right? Obviously, if it would be much harder for China to do this to America, for example, or to some other bigger liberal democracy, perhaps.
It does, though, doesn't it speak to some structural issues with the relationship with our largest partner, that there's no one picking up the phone. And I know that we've had a year where we've often said people are prepared to forgive mistakes, but that sense of going out hard on the inquiry into the initial outbreak just strikes me as having been a little bit Trumpy at the time. I don't know, like maybe even carrying Trump's baggage on that occasion. I don't know, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on between them and News Limited at the time as well, in terms of spreading bat theories and whatnot. But are we kind of an innocent victim, or are we partly an architect of our own difficulties at the moment?
Well, you're basically saying, have we asked for it? Well, look, at some level, that yes, we have asked for it, but it's not only. I mean, what triggered this particular diplomatic conflagration, as you say, Pete, is the call for the independent inquiry. That was the catalyst where things went sharply south. But there's a whole context, though, to Australia's actions. It wasn't just Morrison's. That was gauche diplomatically, for sure, right? But there's a bunch of other things that Australia has done over the last couple of years. We have, we've basically created a stink for China on 5G and Huawei.
Yeah.
We have imposed foreign interference, a foreign interference regime in Australia. And I think the thing is, if we sort of step back from it, what Australia's done is we have asked a bunch of questions about China's ambitions before a number of other bigger countries did, right? We've been sending up flares on this front for 2 or 3 years. That's prompted other countries, the Europeans, the Brits, Americans, to ask similar questions in their own democracies, right? So we're a small country that somehow has created a big stink, a big problem for China, and that's what's sitting behind the current flashpoints. It's sort of this irritation, I think, on China's part that we've changed, that we by casting ourselves, is what I said in my piece, by casting ourselves, Australia, I mean, as the canary in the coal mine, right? We're the ones saying, look here, guys, China is becoming more authoritarian, more assertive. We framed a bunch of questions that some other countries weren't asking, and now a number of countries are asking it. I think that's at the root of it. But of course, Morrison, the call for an independent inquiry, particularly in the context which you rightly raised, Peter, which is all of the theories that were doing the rounds at that time about whether or not COVID was in fact, an act, a sort of, a biological act, a lab, right? That if you guys on the call, if you read Bob Woodward's book Rage, you'll see that the Americans were completely convinced about that it was a sort of a hostile act, right? all of those things were reverberating around the world at the time where Morrison called for the independent inquiry. It was a major diplomatic affront. Now, you know, should he have chosen his words more carefully? Yes, of course. I think, although...
But here's the question, politically, is this a rally round the flag moment where there is bipartisan support, or is this a spilt the drinks moment? And I was interesting seeing the comment, I think, of a wine producer the other day going, well, he didn't have to go out so hard. So I think, and, you know, obviously we didn't get a chance to put it in the cycle of this week's poll. We might go back to it next week, but what's your gut? Is this rally around the flag or spilt the drinks?
Well, it's a little bit of both, I think. I mean, it's Morrison certainly playing to domestic politics, like set aside the economic interests here, which are substantial. Morrison is playing to domestic politics to the extent that all leaders understand that COVID has sort of seen this rise of, you know, quasi-nationalism, this sort of backlash against globalization. You know, there's been concerns about China in democracies all around the world, right? So obviously Morrison is alive to that context. But I think the principal difficulty here, though, is now we've sort of, we've got this relationship with China, an economic relationship that has suited both of the countries. We haven't been very assertive about liberal values because we haven't wanted to create an affront. We've done that on the down low. We've done that very quietly and diplomatically with China. We've changed over the last few years, I think, in response to the Xi regime genuinely becoming more authoritarian, more scary. There's the whole South China Sea problem, increasing militarization. So we have become more assertive about values. That's become much more part of the discussion, front-ended in the discussion. And this is the sort of point at which we've reached. It's sort of like, now it is very difficult to reconcile the interests of a liberal democracy with an authoritarian regime.
But that's always been the case, but we were quite happy for 20 years, and our polling was showing us that people were prepared to look past that and saw an economic future in China. So it's not a new development.
Indeed. No, of course, but it's sort of like, but we've sort of, because of a combination of reasons, because of a sort of shift in the global kaleidoscope, because Xi is genuinely more assertive and authoritarian, because of the sort of post-globalization politics, rise of nationalism, rise of populism. It's hard, you know, everyone's playing to their own domestic audiences, but sitting on the sidelines of this confrontation is the business interest you mentioned, Peter. It's like, you know, since we, through the path of kind of creating a relationship with China through a free trade agreement, through, you know, we've encouraged exporters to basically go for broke in the Chinese market. And now, you know, a number of producers, primary producers, wine producers, coal producers, iron ore producers, you know, have a lot of their income tied up in the Chinese market.
How's Labor going to play it, do you reckon?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? So far, they've been chewy on the shoe in terms of, you know, Penny Wong came out quite assertively backing Morrison yesterday about the tweet. So sort of not a cigarette paper or whatever the expression is between us on that stuff, because of course, you know, there'll be a supposition here that part of the play in Beijing is to try and inject enough pressure into the Australian political system to start to kind of divide players or actors in the Australian political system. So far we've seen a unanimity between Labor's lines and the government's, although I think there's a fair bit of gritted teeth in the unanimity, because I think the view in Labor is that Morrison has stuffed this up, has been gauche, has pushed it harder than it needed to be pushed. But those views don't tend to be articulated so much in public.
Hey, I'm going to go into a little bit of this week's polling now, recognising that we didn't have this, I don't know, it just wasn't on my radar when we put the questions in the field last week, and maybe I got it wrong, I don't know. But we did ask a question that kind of speaks to it, which we constructed a binary proposition, which I was really interested in exploring, about whether people felt out of this year that and we force them to say, which of these do you agree with more? One of which is almost a statement about looking outwards, and the other is a statement about looking inwards. So the one proposition is the pandemic has shown the world is interconnected. The best way to respond to global threats in the future is to cooperate and provide assistance to other countries, kind of the kumbaya principle. And the other one is kind of the pandemic has shown that in times of crisis, it's every country for itself. Australia needs to be economic strong and maintain strict border protections to deal with global threats in the future. Probably the kind of we decide Mark 2.0, 2.0. 52-48, it's kind of split down the middle. And I know that, you know, they're not a natural binary. So it was very much, which do you most agree with? I was actually surprised the kind of more nativist proposition actually wasn't much stronger than just almost line ball.
Yeah, well, it's sort of like, you know, what did Trump say? The UN, the world's, you know, divided into between patriots and globalists. I mean, you know, which is obviously a ridiculous false binary as well. But it could have been higher. But I think at the end of the day, even though we live in complex times, I think there's a strong cohort in the Australian population that are you know, that understand that globalisation has benefited Australia in all kinds of ways, who like the idea of being plugged into global systems, who like multiculturalism, who like having opportunities existing in global labour markets, all of that sort of stuff. There are people who naturally incline, you know, inflect to that sort of view of the world, and then there are people who view globalization as a threat. Again, like you foregrounded, and I would as well, that these binaries are a bit forced, right? Because all of us are capable of having these sentiments simultaneously within ourselves, right? We're complex. We're complex beings. We're humans, right? We can have complex views on things, but yeah, you'd think the environment would be more nativist. Whether nativism would have been higher than that, but I think a couple of things sort of counterpoise it in Australia. One is that sense that we genuinely have been beneficiaries of globalisation. I mean, where things have gone to poop in America and in parts of Europe is that that they are less equal societies. So the benefits of globalisation, of free trade, of open markets have not been distributed as fairly as they have been in Australia. And that is sort of one of the things that sits behind the kind of, you know, the rise of populism that we've seen post GFC, right? So things are different. Australia is its own country, I would just say. We've got our own experiences of these phenomena, and perhaps that's reflected in the fact that the thing seems quite evenly balanced, even in COVID times.
The interesting thing, and John will correct me if I get this wrong in the crosstabs, was there was a big split to what Campbell was talking about before on education. So on people that had gone no further than a high school education, I think it was kind of 60-40, and maybe the reverse the other way for those with a university education. So much more open looking. Have I got that right, John?
A little bit more for the high school education. So 64-36 towards the nativist view for that group, and 59-41 for university educated.
Yeah. Well, it's not surprising. It's not even visceral. It's rational. I mean, you know, the people who are beneficiaries of the globalized economy are high skilled workers, right? And higher education is only there as a proxy for skills, right? In a way. So it's not surprising. Like, it's easy to support, you know, a set of propositions that benefit you materially and are seen to benefit others. If you are, you know, if you feel left behind by those opportunities, if you are not, you know, on a university campus graduating with a computer engineering degree, being, you know, recruited by Microsoft before you even finish at ANU or whatever your experience happens to be, you know, that world is not open to you. That world is completely closed to you. So no wonder there are different views depending on your level of, and, you know, we're saying education as a proxy for skills and opportunity, right?
Indeed. it just seems an interesting context for these sort of, to use a wanky term, geopolitical battles that we're kind of living through at the moment. Because the other point is that the people that will be hurt first from these trade decisions aren't symbolic analysts. They're people working in primary resources, people working in logistics, people working in the mines. So yeah, it's a real thing. Look,
yeah, it's not, that's what I was trying to say before, obviously not very coherently, but it's
better than me today.
It's not it's not a gut proposition, it's a lived proposition is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, what we're
so anyway, there's a couple of other related issues that we canvassed that I'll flick through. We always ask about foreign aid with a degree of trepidation because we know the results are never going to be great. And what we started doing was actually, before we asked the question, ask people how much aid do you think we're giving or dispensing as a proportion of the federal budget. I think the number is under 1%. I think it hovers between about 0.3 and 0.5. Only 6%. You get like, maybe 14% on those get close to that. And what's really interesting then is obviously the more you think we got, the more you think that the government's spending too much, which is kind of a nice little trick that we've played over the years. But the one on foreign aid that really fascinated me, and you've got to do the adding up for this to make sense. So we always ask, spends too little. John, your spelling, you've missed an O there, but I'll let you off because it was a rush today. Spends too little, spends about the right, spends too much. If you sequence that out, and the dark one at the right is the most recent one, and it goes back to 2011. This is actually the first time that if you add up too little and the right amount, you actually get more than spends too much. So it's only at the edges, but if you were clustering that up, there's kind of net support in the current environment for the aid that we do give. And we're actually going to be running one of these on Thursday with the Gates Foundation and Results Australia, looking at Australia's aid into the Pacific and the region following in the wake of the pandemic. And the government's actually been quite forthcoming with money on this occasion. Now, again, I suspect aid is now becoming part of that geopolitical discussion, and the idea if you don't give aid into your region, you're departing the field for China is part of it as well. But that's a little bit of a shift in attitude there.
It's interesting. Yeah, it is interesting. And yeah, aid, well, I mean, aid is obviously always been an instrument of soft power, but there's been this whole debate because, of course, this government massively cut aid when it came to power. There's a significant cut, which is sort of now so deep that even the patch jobs by this government are not sufficient to restore what has been removed from the budget. But now because there is a competition for hearts and minds in the region. China has been, well, I shouldn't say spending up big in the region, I should say loaning up big in the region seems to be the issue. And of course, Australia vacated that field. So we're playing a bit of catch up, and perhaps, the biggest in a PR sense, weirdly, perhaps the greatest case for aid is to say we're in a competition with China that we have to win. Possibly that actually makes the concept of aid more popular in the community, because has been in Australia for a long time this sort of deep set feeling that aid's, we shouldn't be doing it. We should be. Well,
you and I know that border protection has been a defining organising principle of Australian politics since at least 2000, and probably back to the White Australia policy, and the idea of both economic, particularly economic security by supporting the region is compelling at the moment, isn't it?
Totally. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Bit of a shift in climate as well, I thought, that was interesting. So we asked a bunch of questions at the height of the bushfires. And then we've asked them again now, particularly around those two zero carbon pollution targets for 2030 and 2050, obviously slightly, but not significantly more support, but the shifts of 10% for both. So I would have thought the bushfires would have been a peak moment for, you know, wanting to see a bit of action, but that hasn't subsided through the global pandemic. I know you sort of pulled that out in your piece in The Guardian today.
Yeah, well, I was surprised by this. I mean, it is consistent with some other surveys that we've seen this year that indicates that sentiment in favour of climate action is continuing to build rather than dissipate. I just applied the sort of old-fashioned kind of mindset that if we were in the middle of a recession, then climate, people's material action or material interests would come to the fore, and climate action might kind of slide down the hierarchy of needs, but doesn't seem to have happened on these results, which are really interesting. It is a bit of a mixed bag once we move to coal, though, Peter.
Oh yes.
It's sort of like if you were being crude and sort of lining up the answers to these two questions, right? The sort of intensifying public sentiment in favour of action, but then when we get into coal and power. The questions around coal and power, we get into some divisions basically in the Australian community, and those divisions have been seeded by an absolutely toxic political debate for the best part of a decade. So it's sort of like, I don't know, my take on these numbers in total is that we definitely support climate action in Australia. There is a growing constituency for it. But it becomes a more complex proposition, though, if there is a feeling that there are people who are losers, or if there is a cost associated to action. Now, these questions sort of aren't perfectly designed to tease out those many nuances. But if you put those two things together, that's what you see. That if you ask people in polls whether they support net zero, or whatever your climate action question is, you will get super majorities now, like not just tepid majorities, super majorities. But if you say, well, what about the coal industry, and are you prepared to sort of pay for climate action through higher energy prices, for example? That wasn't our question this week, but you could read our question as sort of being suggestive of that. Then people kind of back off slightly now, and that to me sort of answers or points to the central mystery in Australia, which is why we tell pollsters we want climate action, and we appear to actually want climate action, but we don't vote for it.
Yeah. My take is that somewhere along the line, climate change has become another bit of identity politics, and it's kind of a slogan that for everyone that rallies around the flag, it puts off another amount. And I think where Labor's trying to land, and I suspect where the coalition wants to land as well, is just have a discussion about energy, have a discussion about transition at different paces, and just get the T-shirts out of it. And I suspect that's actually the only way through. As someone that's always worn T-shirts as well, I just don't know how useful the T-shirts are.
Well, sure, I haven't worn the T-shirts, but I've spent, like a very solid proportion of the last decade, shouting from every open microphone that we need climate action for the reasons we need it, because it's scientifically necessary, and it is economically necessary, because Australia is stuffed if we don't make this transition. We have our entire wealth, our prosperity, our material prospects bound up in fossil fuel exports. If we don't start to make this transition now and the world decarbonises, we are stuffed. There is no nice words you can put around this. So, obviously I support climate action both for scientific and economic reasons, but I agree that it's sort of like...
So I wonder if those, sorry to interrupt, you finish your line of thought.
No. I was just going to say, look, I'm sort of with you. I mean, obviously, evangelism doesn't work, or phases of evangelism doesn't work, because it activates and reactivates different sectors in the community, as you say, around identity and other things. We do need to kind of lower there has been this recurring phenomenon that the more prominent climate is in the debate, if climate is on page 1 of a newspaper, the further away from action we get, right? Like, we do actually need to lower the temperature around this debate and have a more factual conversation. And you're right, Peter, there is a convergence on both the major parties to try and find some language around that sort of de-escalates and disarms some of the debate of the past. But there's got to be good faith in that process too, and we need to wait and see whether or not what we're heading towards is a good faith enterprise, or whether it's just lowest common denominator dressed up as an attempt at good faith. Anyway,
I just wonder if all those coal ships off the Chinese coast aren't a reverse tamper back to border protection. Like, if the value of that coal, if there aren't buyers, sort of, well, this is a massive recalibration, isn't it?
This is the critical point. This is the critical point. And I suppose if we're talking about that we've lost a decade because of, absolutely shit lowest common denominator politics, missteps and other things, what the critical mistake of presenting climate change to people as an act of faith or an act of evangelism is,
or a virtue. Like, I do think we're better than you because we believe.
Right. Like, really big mistake, because it takes the whole debate out of the fact-based realm and it sort of makes it a crusade. This is not a crusade. These are practical material problems that we and every other country on the planet face. And I think if the debate can turn to the economic consequences of not acting. We've had 10 years in this country of this arid debate about the costs of action, right? It's gone over and over again with, someone else's crap modelling competing with someone else's crap modelling about what does climate action cost. We failed to ask ourselves, what does not acting cost us? And not acting costs us massively. We are more exposed to climate change than a number of other countries because of the composition of our economy and because of our climate. So it's sort of like, in that kind of tamping this discussion down, taking it out of faith versus, other propositions, taking the evangelism out of it, hopefully people will start to engage with the serious risks we face economically. We will be stranded and we will be broke if we do not make this transition. And we have to make this transition quickly. We've wasted a decade. We can't waste another one. It's just not an option.
And, I guess the lesson of 2020 is that when faced with a clear and present threat, we actually have a political system that's capable of following the science and turning things around fairly quickly.
Exactly. We do.
That question, can we learn from our success?
Yes. Well, oh God, I hope so, because we really need to.
All right. Well, we're running down to the hour. Next fortnight will be our final essential poll for the year. We kind of tend to do a year in review, asking people, what sort of year it's been. I suspect if we do an open-ended word cloud, there'll be one word in the middle of it. But anything you're particularly interested in tapping at this stage? I know we'll talk offline, but if there's anything that's at the front of your mind, or anyone in the chat that wants anything in particular, let us know as John starts constructing our valedictory for 2020.
I think it'll just be a really interesting retrospective this year. It's been such an amazing year, and courtesy of your efforts and John's efforts, we have like this amazing data set of how the country looked, sounded, felt like over the last 12 months, sort of the most kind of important 12 months that any of us have experienced in quite a long time. And, some sort of getting to the nub of what we might have learned from this, I think would be a really interesting way to end the year. But, I don't have any particularly smart thoughts about that, but I will develop.
That and a drink.
Yes, well, make it a double. Yes.
Yeah. Hey, all the best. Good luck with the rest. There's 2 more weeks of sitting, aren't there? There's
this one and next. Yeah.
We're expecting something on the pay for news, which might be good news for news outlets into the future. Anything else that's sort of outstanding business before the end of the year?
Well, we've in terms of what's happening with
IR.
Yeah, we've got IR. We've got a few moving parts actually. We've got the digital codes. We've got IR. There's all kinds of rats and mice legislation that just needs to be passed before the end of the year. Then we've got 2 reshuffles, one in the government and one on the Labor side. Then we'll have the final emissions projections. If you, like me, are obsessed with climate change, we're getting those in December. Like there's a bunch of stuff basically between now and Christmas. So, you know, no rest for the wicked.
Well, you keep doing it. We'll keep reading The Guardian. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Always great to have a really vibrant chat going. I've become really hopeless at calling people in to ask questions, but it's been great seeing all the chat going on in the on the side there. As I say, we'll be back on Thursday with a special town hall. Bill Botel, who's was the architect of the HIV effort, a health expert coming straight in from Delhi, Results Australia, which is the Gates initiative, and The Guardian's Ben Doherty driving the chair on Thursday. So that should be a great discussion as well. So we'll see you guys then, and thanks everyone for joining us today.